Hello and welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kibs, and today we're going to be taking a look at how the Star League came to command all the great houses, eventually bringing a relative peace across the civilizations of mankind, bringing a golden age of technology and prosperity. An era in which the Star League reigned for over 200 years, from 2571 marking the end of the Age of War, a period in which war ravaged all colonized space, to 2751, marking the collapse of the League, sparking off the first of 4 succession wars that would ravage the sphere for hundreds of years to come. During this time, the great houses, Merrick of the Free Worlds League, Kurita of the Draconis Combine, Davion of the Federated Suns, Steiner of the Lyran Commonwealth, and Liao of the Capellan Confederation would defer to the will of a single man. This ruler would be known as the First Lord, ruler of the Star League and second to no man. But before we delve into the beginnings, firstly we need to talk about sources. For today's lore video, our primary source material will be the Star League Sourcebook. It was commissioned by Comstar's First Circuit and published on the 4th of October 3028, after 10 years of exhaustive research, creating the most extensive report on who and what the Star League was. Now, you'll often hear of how the Star League was the brainchild of Ian Cameron. This is partially true. The Star League's origins date back to the Western Alliance on pre-jump drive technology Terra. The Western Alliance was a culmination of Western nations that had formed under one banner, eventually forming the Terran Alliance, uniting all of man under the first human nation. Even the Terran Hegemony that would rise from the ashes of the Terran Alliance would play huge roles in shaping the yet-to-be-born Star League. A little bit of a refresher for you lads and lasses. The Cold War did not end in 1991 in the Battletech universe. The Cold War went on a couple decades longer. It is important to note, as the USSR did not collapse from economic stress, rather it actually collapsed from civil war. The Civil War sparked in 2011 as Premier Oleg Tikhonov was assassinated by extreme communist elements within the government of the USSR. Now, Oleg Tikhonov was not a very good commie, as he had some more liberal values than a lot within the government would have liked. Thusly, the extreme elements feared that Tikhonov would allow for more capitalistic influences within their empire, which is why they had him assassinated in the first place, in an attempt to thwart the capitalist agenda. However, it had precisely the opposite effect. It initiated an internal power struggle within the USSR, as elements of the communist regime soon came under fire from their own populace, and in some cases, even their own armed forces began to defect to rebel elements. As the fighting raged on within the USSR, so too did it spill over to the puppet states in Eastern Europe, as many nations sought their freedom from the Soviet occupiers. In Poland, the Poles valiantly attempted to expel their oppressors. However, the Soviet forces loyal to the regime executed extreme brutality, bombing cities and towns, leveling them utterly. This crushed the Polish rebellion into obscurity. In the West, NATO watched with horror as the brutalities unleashed upon civilian populations, towns, and even cities turned them to ruin. However, as the conflict continued to escalate, pity for these nations turned to utter panic. As the insurrections grew, it became apparent that 2 equally matched forces had formed, one loyal to Tikhonov's ideals and the other to the communist regime. A very rational fear took hold in the West. The panic stemmed from the fighting as the 2 factions vied for the nuclear arsenal of the USSR. Fearing that the weapons would be unleashed upon the world, the Western nations under NATO were forced to act. The combined armies of NATO began their thrust. Pushing the Soviets out of Germany, they then thrust southwards, liberating Czechoslovakia. Then onwards east, liberating Poland from the Red Menace. One of the Baltic nations was able to break free on her own, Latvia. Now the newly independent offered her port of Riga to NATO to begin pushing from the north into Soviet lands. As their forces met Russian liberals in Soviet-held territory, they formed a solid alliance, NATO pledging to help liberate them as they both had a common enemy in the Soviets. This would begin to crush the Soviet forces, as they were now outnumbered and quickly running out of supplies. However, a single Soviet division would eventually succeed in breaking through to Latvia and attack using chemical weapons to prevent reinforcements from the north. However, it was already too late, as they had lost the war by this point, and it was kind of over. With the pockets of communist forces now being gobbled up and destroyed by combined rebel and NATO forces, the war was over. Peace would be restored. The cost of manpower and resources was high, however. But this left the United States as the only remaining superpower in the world. Not too long into their peace, the British Prime Minister approached America with an offer of a new alliance more powerful than NATO or the UN. A Western Alliance, it was called, to ensure peace and security throughout their new world, so that they would never have to fear another Soviet-like power. The politicians began laying the groundwork for how much a member of their alliance would have in terms of power within the alliance. A formula was developed with the aid of some brighter minds, based upon a nation's resources and industrial capacity and potential for development, would determine who had the most power. Most members of the proposed alliance agreed, as it ensured every nation within the alliance would be treated equitably for the most part, in terms of who wielded power. America, notably, would not join initially. The poorer nations were also more than ecstatic with the plan, supporting it fully. Leaders from the United States were a little more reluctant, seeing little gain from the globalist order for their own nation and people, as instead they would have to carry the burdens of the lazier nations. The fledgling forming Western Alliance resorted to terrorizing America into membership, as they threatened a mass global boycott of American products to destroy their economy. Avoiding economic disaster, America joined the alliance. The Western Alliance quickly convinced weaker nations from the formerly deposed Soviet Empire to join their broadening borders. As the powers within the WA expanded, so too did they see a need to remove any opposition, creating the Western Alliance Armed Forces, or WAAF for short, quickly disbanding armies of member states, removing any potential threats from within their new growing power. They tested their multinational force in 2023 by defeating China's co-Asian prosperity sphere, who had attempted to subjugate Japan earlier. With the last threat eliminated, many of the nations began to join the WA across the globe. As nations were brought up, eventually some boon was received to the greater whole as technology increased and the quality of life across the WA improved. By 2086, more than 120 nations were now members of the Western Alliance. This is where they would change their name to the Terran Alliance, and where their true colors were slowly unveiled. As the lazier nations now held more power as they had previously, riding off the backs of the more powerful nations of the past, they decided to change or add some depth to the admittance process of the Terran Alliance. Instead of aiding those nations like they had been, they greedily took over taxation and stripping them dry of resources. New members were treated very poorly, as often civil wars erupted as the globalist New Order crushed them with their superior military forces. In the news, you'd hear none of it, as they were instead busy excitedly talking about new advances in technology, such as fusion reactors being downscaled to 1/10 their former size. Atomic power was easily becoming cheaper and cheaper, discovering new ways of producing clean atomic energy that had nearly zero effect on the environment. Environmental engineers set their eyes on Venus and Mars and set about terraforming them even. While this was underway, the rediscovery of the Kearney and Fujita's pan-dimensional gravitational mathematics, I know, quite a mouthful, were unveiled in 2102. This opened the gateway to sending man outside of their own solar system, and so began one of the largest scientific projects in mankind's history. The project's name? Project Deimos. Its aim to create a faster-than-light ship capable of using Kearney and Fujita's Einsteinian science. On the 5th of December, 2108, the TAS Pathfinder successfully performed a round trip, leaving from Terra to the Tau Ceti system, and returning back again. A fever took over the nations under the Terran Alliance, a desire to leave and explore the unknown, as shipyards were retooled to produce colony vessels and jump ships. Some nations even fought within the Alliance over rights to use them. As the fever took hold to explore and find a new home out in the stars, free of the burdens of the past, a new page in their lives, if you will, Thousands, then millions took to the ships. Not long after, the first colony was established in 2116 on Tau Ceti IV, which would become known as New Earth. Thousands of ships left Terra, so many and in such disarray that the bureaucratic machine of the Terran Alliance lost track of thousands, if not most of them. It was pretty bad. Man was jumping off into unknown space, and in most cases, very few in charge knew where to and even how far for that matter. In 2172, the Terran Alliance organized the first Grand Survey, a collection of ships whose goal was to discover the many colonies that had expanded outwards. Once the survey had completed, or more so ran out of time, they had reported discovering over 100 colonized systems, spread across an 80 light-year expanding sphere in diameter. In 2235, the fourth Grand Survey had found more than 600 colonized systems. By now, the Terran Alliance quickly realized that they were expanding a lot faster than they were ready for. The Terran Alliance was in complete disarray. The discovery of the Kearney-Fuchida Drive had come too swiftly, as the rapid expansion pulled and tore at the unstable Terran government. The ramifications were felt. The repercussions, however, had yet to take an impact. Most colonies depended on Mother Terra for technical support or otherwise. As time went on, however, that quickly changed as many colonies became more independent and did not require Terran Alliance assistance, thus making them not very compliant with Terran governance. At first, the most notable resistance was the formation of an ice cartel. Now, what exactly is an ice cartel, I hear you ask? Were iceberg-carrying jump ships. Now, why the ice? The ice was so that the colonies that relied on ice or water supplies from Terra no longer needed to rely on Terra alone. This took away some of the Terran Alliance authority. One more notable cartel that formed was the Rhine Cartel, which functioned as a primary source for water for many frontier colonies. With the supplies of water up, people began to breed more, and as they bred, their population continued to swell. Thusly, their autonomy and industrial capacity steadily rose. The relations between Terra and the colonies, especially those farthest from, only continued to worsen from this. Now, at this point, the Terran Alliance government was corrupt, overburdened, and a bureaucratic nightmare. At their capital of Geneva, two polarized political parties were really at the helm. The Expansionist Party and a sort of not really liberalistic party, whose ideals were also equally questionable. Both parties touted unity, however, both had different approaches. Little remains to know what either truly stood for. However, we do know that the Expansionists were at the helm when the shit hit the fan. That shit splattered gloriously into the TA's face when in 2236, a coalition of colonies at the edge of the sphere declared independence from the Terran Alliance. Now, it's important to know that the Terran Alliance military is more like a glorified police force at this point. Only exception is their marine forces. Being that the case, it was the Marines who were dispatched to crush the colonies. They would start firstly at Denabella, the first planet to declare independence. The Expansionist Party, of course, putting all their credibility into the glorious reconquest of these lost colonies. And 18 months later, the Marines returned utterly defeated and crushed. What was supposed to be a curb stomp turned into a massive clashing of armies, and, of course, the armies being crushed underneath the boots of the enemy was the Terran Marines. Over a single world, rather than, a few disgruntled rebels taking potshots from obscure positions. So, bit of a letdown, that one. The Expansionist Party is going to now be looking at new jobs for the time being. Leave it to the Liberal Party to use the deaths of thousands of people to advance their political agenda, as they were now sweeping into office to put forth their new agenda for the Terran Alliance. The Liberalist Party revealed to the public a memo that the Expansionists wanted to restrict their immigration rights to the colonies. Now the people were in a tizzy, as many wanted the option open for obvious reasons. 2237 rolls around, and unsurprisingly, the Liberal Party is in power. So excited were they to implement their tolerant human policies that would bring peace and stability to mankind. And how would they do this? They decided to grant every single colony outside of the 30 light-year diameter around Terra independence. And by 2242, the last colony was granted independence outside of their 30 light-year sphere. Those colonies that were unable to feed themselves, well, most of them aren't here anymore, so there's that, I guess. The liberals had ushered in what would become known as, for those who lived outside the TA sphere, the Age of War. That was now sweeping the chaos that was the rest of the sphere, so most of man is now screaming and dying and killing each other and starving. But meanwhile in the sphere, and inside the TA sphere, the 30 light-year diameter one, there would be peace for, well, a while. Within the Terran Alliance, backroom deals and shady accidents, the TA bloated and corruption swelled within it. Votes became meaningless as tampered ballots flooded the ballot boxes. Technological progress had all but halted, as resources had turned to try to feed the many hungry masses within the Terran Alliance. Fights broke out within the TA Parliament building, and soon spread like wildfire to encompass the entirety of the Terran Alliance in that 30 light-year diameter. Civil war and chaos now reigned throughout what was left of the former Terran Alliance. At this point, it's less of a nation and more of chaos. Everything has crumbled and broken down. Things had gotten so out of hand, like even obtaining such things like a driver's license was so ludicrously overcomplicated and just overburdening that most people didn't even bother. Not to mention, stating your political ideology or opinion would more than likely get you beat up or more than likely get you killed. A few things to make note of now that the Terran Alliance is in a state of internal conflict, that while this takes place, the rest of the sphere will see the formation of the Great Houses, such as the Capellan Confederation forming Rimward, the Free Worlds League forming Anti-Spinward, and the Lyran Commonwealth forming Coreward, along with the Draconis Combine, with the Federated Suns forming Spinward. Bear in mind that the center always being in Terra, where the Terran Hegemony is in the process of beginning to form from the ashes of the Terran Alliance. Now, while the internal struggle between the Expansionists and the Liberals raged on, the Alliance Global Militia, that glorified police force I mentioned earlier, that didn't suffer any major damage other than the Marine Corps being thrashed thoroughly on Dinabella from the Secessionist War. Yeah, they are in tip-top shape. Well, more or less, at least. While the internal struggle continues and the Alliance crumbles, the AGM is standing back idly, refusing to take sides in the ongoing conflict. The AGM had throttled and threatened both the Liberals and the Expansionists to begin funding their operations even, and to cease major hostilities to one another, bringing back a sort of relative calm, to allow them to improve and upgrade their flotilla of security ships into the first interstellar navy even. This gave them an unprecedented leveraging tool over the two parties, so they kind of funded that. It actually, during their rise to dominance within the ruins of the Terran Alliance, that recruiters actually even had to turn away some people that wanted to join. So you have this new faction sort of developing, the AGM sort of just emerging from the chaos as this sort of like beacon of hope. So people started looking at them and being like, yeah, no, these guys can lead. So they started getting a lot of popularity. So you can definitely see the AGM rising above the two parties thrashing at each other's throats. Now there's something we're going to talk about next. It's a person called James Mckenna. He would later become Admiral Mckenna in the Terran Hegemony, but we're going to have to delve a little bit back into a little bit about his backstory. So there's going to be a little bit of a sort of a backup just a second. Take a look at his life. James Mckenna had grown up in the Yukon territories of Canada. Now, what's weird about James is he didn't begin formal schooling until age 12, which when he did begin school, he showed remarkable skills in both science and history, having been raised by a family whose lineage had a long track record of service dating as far back to the Western Alliance, before it was called the Terran Alliance. He was offered a scholarship by an AGM recruiter to the Annapolis Naval Academy in the United States of America. Remember that at this point, many nations still held a sort of resemblance to their centuries past counterparts, even provinces into the hegemony period would retain some level of their ancient geopolitical borders, if you will. Eventually graduating with honors, his career in the flotilla of the AGM was outstanding, impressing his superiors. However, his outspoken nature and questioning of things led to 5 demotions over the course of his career, until he spent the bettermost of his early career expunging his record, eventually becoming admiral even. In 2295, he eventually assumed command of the entire Alliance Navy, so he was quite the charismatic lad at that. He then pushed for construction of what he called a true space navy, as most of their ships until Mckenna's arrival had been purely troop transports. 5 years later, in 2300, the TAS Dreadnought was launched into service, marking the first dedicated warship in the sphere. Like, the first true warship. Everything else had been troop transports or support vessels at this point. Over the course of the next 14 years under Mckenna's stewardship, they launched an additional 6 heavy warships of the similar sort of class, as well as 20 lesser warships, using primarily Terra, Mars, and Venus's orbital construction platforms that were used previously for the initial colonization and rapid expansion, because they had the logistical means sort of set up to get that in motion. Now, for the most part, many viewed the construction as unnecessary at best. However, even Mckenna's strategic mind would not have foreseen how quickly those ships would be needed. A decade later, in 2310, a new political party was established within the TA, having now been, for the most part, stabilized for the time being. It was called the People's Independence Party, which would lead to something that would become known as the Zoli Affair. Now, Zoli, or Grant Zoli, was the leader of this newly established party. The third party had formed, claiming to be the forgotten voice of the people. Now, a little bit about Grant Zoli. Grant was the illegitimate child of a Kenyan mother and a New Zealander. He had a rough life growing up in New Zealand, as the economic upheaval had turned the small island nation into a very slummy and poor region of the world. Granted, everywhere else on Terra isn't doing so swell either. He was arrested for theft as a teenager and was sent to prison. While in prison, the young Grant was able to partake in a built-in education system to the TA school system, and he learned rather quickly how to abuse this. Discovering his own knack for manipulation, he had a talent for weaseling through loopholes, and a really good one at that. Rules and regulations. He managed to just anything, he could sort of find a loophole and just weasel right through. So, you can already see where this is going. Unsurprisingly, upon leaving the prison, he entered politics, or once he got out of the prison, I should say. Certainly a good place to take those new skills. Now, being the great weasel he no doubtedly was, he had used a small political party within New Zealand to launch into bigger and bigger positions, eventually becoming the Prime Minister of New Zealand. His only ambition was really to get as filthy fucking rich as humanly possible. However, this didn't stop him from thinking bigger, as he pushed the small NZ party to expand interplanetary. At this point, we'll call their party PIP for short. Mostly for my own sanity. Now, when 2310 rolls around, PIP is sitting very well, and it looks like they could be a huge deciding force in the upcoming TA election cycle in 2314. Grant is a slippery little cunt. So, as the elections are coming closer, he is kind of sitting on the fence. As both parties know by now, he can be bought. While he sits on his fence, weaseling as much as he possibly can, each party, the expansionists and the liberals, approach him with more and more of that delicious money he has been searching for to quench his insatiable greed. In documents that would be uncovered later, it would be determined that Grant had pledged his support to the expansionists in the August of 2314, and had had a sort of a change of heart, switching his allegiances to the Liberal Party on September 2314, just a month before elections. However, before the elections took place, Grant was found dead in his NZ mansion. Yeah, we kind of saw that coming. His death, so close to the election, caused both the Liberal and Expansionist parties to begin blaming one another, unsurprisingly, which sparked Zealot supporters to begin attacking and even assassinating members of both parties. This forced the Parliament of the TA's hand to enact martial law to try to bring order, ordering the AGM to put down the rebellion on Terra. A rebellion which seemed to be hottest in NZ. Unsurprisingly, on September 30th, Liberalist guards stormed the Expansionist party room, massacring everyone inside. This, in turn, sparked the conflict further, as once again Terra began to destabilize yet further. While this is going on, some units of the AGM are persuaded to take sides in both political parties, basically attacking the Liberals or the Expansionists, either or. Meanwhile, Mckenna is asked to intervene by Parliament to stop the fighting. He does so in a couple of instances. At the Battle of Zurich and Bangkok were the most notable, as AGM forces were successfully able to break up combatants and restore the peace for the time being. However, things looked a little bit dire as everything seemed to continue to spiral out of control, and it seemed like the entire of the TA was going to crumble. Not just Terra, but conflict was essentially spreading to other worlds, or was on the verge of boiling over. One instance, I'm going to quote something from Mckenna. He said this on June 2nd, 2315. Attention all AGM members currently participating in barbarities. Cease all hostile actions and return to your barracks, or I will bombard you into oblivion. So that was him talking to Terran forces on Terra. Now, or AGM forces on Terra, as well as everyone else. More specifically, AGM forces, though. You can tell already that his fleet is going to come in huge handy. It's going to be extremely handy to have, because now Mckenna can sort of have leverage over the rebels and basically be like, all right, so if you want to rebel, go ahead, but I'll bombard you. There's nothing you can do about it, because there's not any sort of orbital defense systems or technology to really counter the fleet yet. So there's a distinct advantage that Mckenna has that he will be using to leverage to bring order to the TA space. Now, while everything you know is kind of burning on Terra, Mckenna organized his fleet to rendezvous around Mars. He then ordered the fleet to Terra once they had all regrouped, in which they bombarded and destroyed Sandroc in Scotland and a tiny island off the coast of Australia. He then broadcasted a message saying he was willing and able to bombard anyone who dared jam his broadcast to the people of Terra. He very much favored the whole bombardment thing. Him and I kind of see eye to eye on that whole matter. But I'm going to read you verbatim what he had said. So this is going to be kind of long-winded, but, take it for what it's worth. Full quote. All right, so Mckenna said to the people once he was able to broadcast, or once he began broadcasting, "You have all been suffering through a bitter war. Many, mostly the innocent, have been injured or lost. Everything they own in the fighting, even the fortunate few who have gone unscathed thus far, must have some friend or loved one who has suffered. Terra has been a dark place these past few weeks, with little hope of getting brighter. I ask you now, what is the purpose of this suffering? Do you believe that this war is a true and honorable one that will make your lives any better? Do you honestly believe that if one side or the other wins, it will benefit you? It is my view that all of us have been duped by the lies and deceit of a few wily politicians. They have led you to believe that this war will somehow end your and the Alliance's problems, once and for all. They lie. They struggle for personal power, and not for your benefit. It is time for change. The government is corrupt and must go. We must bring back the voice of the people so that it may be heard. I propose the founding of a new government to replace the Alliance. A strong government, responsive to its people, yet unburdened by constant and useless elections. A strong government that will re-establish Terra as the proper center of humanity. Fellow humans, it is time that we cease to behave in the violent ways of the Homo sapiens and begin to behave in the way of Homo stellaris, men and women of the stars. Those who share this view need only lay down their weapons and return home to await further messages. Those who do not agree to change had best be warned. I intend to hunt every last one of you and feed you to the public that has been so badly abused. Now, some say that he had been planning this for quite some time, and I actually kind of agree with some. You'll find some articles saying that he, always intended for this to happen, such as, he'd revoked the shore leave of everyone on his ship, or not his ship, but all the troop transports and everything, for the last couple of weeks. He also made it no secret that he disliked the current government. He was very loud about it. Remember about his previous life where he'd been very talkative about how he thought the AGM should be operated, and that's what got him demoted a couple of times. Once he had gotten to the higher rank, he was able to speak a little bit more freely when he became the admiral of all the AGM. He also made sure that the ships were loaded with even more ammo than was necessary. So they had extra ammunition, there was no shortage of supplies, double rations, everything. So there's a lot to suggest that, Mckenna was wise and he was prepared for this. But what you can sort of see in this speech that he said here is he's already talking about this new government. And this new government we're going to talk about, this is the beginning of the Terran Hegemony. This is the death of elections and democracy. At this point, democracy has become so corrupt in this universe that it is no longer considered what we consider it today. It's as if, imagine how corrupt the governments around the world are today. They're pretty bad, but now imagine it worse, to the point where we've had it for almost a century for 3 centuries of just utter shit. Of countries, in civil war, strife, starvation, all these things. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. I mean, it's a miracle that the TA has managed to just been limping along as long as it has. But this is the death of the Terran Alliance and the birth of the Terran Hegemony. Now, once this speech had taken place, his word sort of spread across the globe. I mean, it was broadcasted almost everywhere. People took to the streets and began, supporting him openly. Then you saw both parties begin to frantically, try to defect or refuse to surrender. And what happened was Mckenna didn't want to bombard the cities where these people were hiding. He actually sent down Marines to go and hunt them out. Alive if possible, dead if not. There was really no other choice in the matter. But at this point, this ended both the expansionists and the Liberal Party. I mean, if there was anything left of them, they would be absorbed into the new hegemony government if they were looked at kindly. And in most cases, they weren't. Most of the parties that were left were just brutalized. One thing I want to read you here real quick is a press piece from 2321. It's the Terran Hegemony on Monumental Fraud by Richard Thury. So it's a quote from In-Universe. The dictionary defines hegemony as preponderant influence or authority, especially of one nation over others. In our own Terran Hegemony, the name given to our shiny new government, freedoms have been exchanged for decisiveness, and personal rights abrogated in favor of blindly following one charismatic man. So here you can get a little bit of an inside look at to sort of what was going on at this period. This is kind of a rough period because this is the formation of the Terran Hegemony. The Terran Alliance is no longer really in effect anymore. There's going to be pocket holdouts for the next couple of years, but they're just going to basically just be washed aside. Most people are fed up at this point, and it's over. The Terran Alliance is over. Democracy within the hegemony is over. This is the birth, or would be considered the birth, of sort of feudalism beginning its return. Not the way that you'd see the Camerons bring it in with its nobility in the sense of, the peer list. But this is where you're going to now see that succession will be by birthright, more than anything else. And in the case of Mckenna, you're going to see his son inherit the throne, so to speak, even though it's not quite called that yet. And then the Camerons will take over, which are his cousins. But this concludes the beginning of the Star League, or, well, the beginning of the Terran Hegemony. In the next section, we will actually begin the actual formation of the Star League from the Terran Hegemony. And then from there, we're going to go through the Star League's lifespan and to the end. So it's going to be an interesting series, quite a big series, and then I think we'll wrap it up with the SLDF military forces. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, you have yourself a glorious day, and I thank you all for tuning in to this new lore video. Let me know what you think. I'm using a new recording thing. Besides that, that's kind of everything. So until next time, ta-ta for now, folks.